Why nobody wants to visit Byron Bay anymore. On the far northern coast of New South Wales sits a town of roughly 9,000 permanent residents. Every year it receives close to 2 million visitors, and Australia has fallen out of love with it. Its most famous festival has been cancelled 2 years running. Its second festival is dead, in liquidation. Holiday rentals are capped now by law. The backpackers have gone to Bali. The people who built the town can no longer afford to live in it, while Hollywood quietly bought the coastline around them. This is the story of how the most famous beach town in Australia became a place people leave. It did not begin as a resort. It began as a slaughterhouse and a whaling station, a working town that ran on carcasses and butter and machine oil, on a coast that smelled for most of a century of blood. Before any of that, before the surfers and the film crews and the 2 million a year, it began as a meeting place. Chapter 1. The Meeting Place. Long before the town had a name a share register would recognise, the country around the easternmost point of the Australian mainland belonged to the Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation, and they called the place Cavanbar. The word means meeting place. It was not named for the sea or for the great headland that pushes further into the Pacific than any other point of the continent, but for what happened on the ground beneath it. This was where the northern and the southern tribes came together. Across country that had been walked and fished and burned for thousands of years before a European ever saw it. People arrived here to meet other people. Arrival was the oldest thing this coast did. Older than the lighthouse, older than the whaling, older than the word tourist meant anything at all. The first European to put a name on the headland did not stop to learn the one it already carried. On May 15th, 1770, sailing north along a coast he was mapping for the British Admiralty, James Cook marked the Great Cape and named it Cape Byron. The name did not honour the poet the world would later attach to it. It honoured John Byron, a British naval officer who had circumnavigated the globe and who happened to be the grandfather of the man the poetry would make famous. Cook named the point and sailed on. He did not land. The country stayed exactly as it had been, Arakwal country, seen from a passing deck and written into a chart, and then left alone for the better part of a century more. What finally fixed a European mark on the headland was not a settlement but a light. In 1901, at the top of the Cape Byron lighthouse began to turn, throwing its beam out over the most easterly point of the Australian mainland. It was built to warn ships off the coast, not to welcome anyone to it, and it stood above a place that still had almost nothing beneath it worth stopping for. A meeting place with a light on it. The people who came next did not come to meet anyone. They came to work, and the work they came to do had nothing to do with the view. Chapter 2. Gold, butter, and a jetty. The town that grew below the lighthouse was not built for pleasure. It was built for extraction, the same as any inland field, except that here the field was the coast itself and the sea in front of it. The first thing that drew outsiders in numbers was gold, reported in the country near Byron around 1870, enough to bring prospectors picking through the creeks and beaches, never enough to make anyone rich or to hold them once the easy metal thinned out. The gold came and went the way small fields do. What it left behind was a scatter of people who had come for one reason and stayed for the ordinary ones, land and timber and the slow business of making a living on a coast with no proper way to reach it. The problem in those first decades was the coast itself. There was no harbour, no sheltered water, nothing to load a ship against. Everything the district produced had to be got out across an open beach and an open surf, and everything it needed had to come in the same way. So between 1886 and 1888, the town built the thing that made it a town. A jetty, a long timber arm reaching out from the sand into the Pacific so that vessels could tie up and take on cargo without being driven ashore. The jetty was the whole economy in a single structure. What the country grew and cut and killed went out along its planks and onto the decks of ships, and the town arranged itself behind it accordingly. Then the line came. In 1894, the railway reached the settlement, and with it, the settlement took the name it still carries. Cavanbar, the meeting place, became Byron Bay on the timetables and the station board, an English name for a working stop on a colonial line. The rail joined the jetty, and the two together turned a beach into a port with a hinterland behind it, a way in and a way out. The industry that grew on top of that machinery was dairy. In 1895, the Norco Butter Factory was established, a cooperative of the surrounding farmers, and it turned the green, wet country of the northern rivers into butter that shipped out through the jetty and, in time, halfway around the world. Byron became a butter town, a place of farmers and labourers and merchants, of milk carts and rail sidings, and a factory that ran on the produce of 1,000 small holdings. It was prosperous in the plain, unglamorous way of a town that makes something. And it was about to add a second smell to the butter, one that no postcard would ever carry. Chapter 3. Blood and Oil. The Byron that the 20th century built was not a place of leisure. It was a place of killing floors. In 1930, a meatworks opened at Belongil, on the low ground at the edge of the town, and it did to cattle what the district had already learned to do to milk, industrialize it, and ship it out through the jetty. The meatworks gave the town steady wages and a particular character. It was owned and run by men who understood volume, who understood how to turn a living animal into a product and a product into cargo, and who did not flinch at the parts of that work the town would rather have kept downwind. Then the sea took the machinery away. In 1954, a cyclone struck the coast and wrecked the jetty and the fishing fleet that worked from it, tearing out in a single storm the timber arm the whole economy had leaned on for 66 years. For most towns, that would have been a wound that simply bled. The men who owned the meatworks read it differently. They looked at the ruined jetty and at the water beyond it, and at the great animals that passed the Cape every winter in their thousands on the migration up and down the East Coast, and they saw not a disaster, but a second industry. In 1954, they founded the Byron Whaling Company. For the next 8 years, Byron killed whales. The company took humpbacks off the coast as they moved past the most easterly point of the continent, and it worked them the way the meatworks worked cattle, at scale and without ceremony. The carcasses were towed into what remained of the jetty, and then hauled up and sent on to the factory, where they were rendered down into the thing the whole operation existed to produce, which was oil. Between 1954 and 1962, the Byron Whaling Company processed 1,146 whales. From them, it drew more than 10,000 tons of oil. The animals came in off the sea. Along the same water, Cook had sailed past naming headlands, and left the town as barrels. This was Byron at its working peak, and it is worth holding the picture as it actually was, because almost nothing survives of it in the way the town is imagined now. A jetty rebuilt for hauling in dead whales, a rail line that carried butter and beef and the products of the flensing floor, a factory at Belongil that turned cattle into meat, and a second operation that turned humpbacks into oil, the two of them running on the same coast, owned by the same men, sending their cargo out along the same line. Blood, oil, and butter. That was the smell of the most famous beach town in Australia, for as long as anyone then living could remember. And every part of it was about to end. Chapter 4. The Town That Emptied. The whaling went first, and it did not go because anyone in Byron chose to stop. It went because there was nothing left to catch. By the early 1960s, the humpback population along the East Coast, hunted here and at stations all around the southern oceans, had collapsed toward the point of disappearance, and a whaling company with no whales is only a factory waiting to be told. In 1962, the Byron Whaling Company ceased operations. 8 years, 1,146 animals, and then a sudden silence off the Cape where the boats had worked. The oil stopped. One of the town's two industries closed its doors and did not open them again. The other one held on for another 2 decades, and its ending was slower and, in the end, heavier. The meatworks at Belongil kept killing and packing through the 1960s and the 1970s, the last of the old working Byron, the last reason most of the town got up in the morning. Then, in October 1983, it closed. Around 360 jobs went with it, in a town that did not have 360 other jobs waiting. For a place of that size, the closure was not a setback. It was the removal of the thing the town had been built to do. What followed was the quiet part, the part no cyclone announces. The people who had worked the killing floor and the rail sidings and the factory began to leave because there was no longer any work to keep them, and a town that empties of its workers empties of everything that depends on them. Shops lost their custom, houses lost their buyers. The port that the jetty had made was already gone, its trade long since moved to rail and road, and now the industry that the port had once served was gone as well. Byron in the middle of the 1980s was a coastal town with a lighthouse, a ruined economy, and a great deal of cheap, empty property that nobody with money wanted. And cheap, empty property on a beautiful coast does not stay empty. A working town that has lost its work becomes something else, always. And the thing it becomes is decided by whoever arrives to fill the vacuum it leaves behind. The whalers were gone, and the butchers were going, and the beaches and the point breaks and the warm, cheap houses were sitting there below the turning light, waiting. The people who came next would not come to work at all. They were already on the road, and they were coming for something the old Byron had never thought to sell. Chapter 5. The Aquarius Wave. The town that emptied did not stay empty for long, and the people who filled it did not come for work. They came for the opposite of it. In 1973, some 50 kilometers inland from the coast, in a fading dairy village called Nimbin, a student union staged a 10-day gathering that its organizers called the Aquarius Festival. About 10,000 people came. They came for music, for communal living, for a rejection of the suburban Australia most of them had been raised in, and the newspapers that covered it reached for the only comparison available and called it Australia's Woodstock. The festival ended. Most of the 10,000 went home. But a portion of them looked at the cheap, half-abandoned country of the northern rivers, at the empty farmhouses and the failed dairy leases going for almost nothing, and decided not to leave at all. They settled across the hinterland in the years that followed, on communes and multiple occupancy blocks, in old timber houses that a working family had walked away from, in a district where the land was cheap precisely because the industries that had once paid for it were gone. The dairy economy was failing. The meatworks on the coast still ran, but not for much longer. Into that vacuum came a population that measured a place by what it offered a body and a mind, rather than what it paid a wage. And the far north coast of New South Wales began, quietly, to become something it had never been designed to be. The coast itself already held a different kind of newcomer, and they had arrived first. Surfers had found Byron in the 1960s, drawn not by any festival, but by the shape of the land under the water. Cape Byron pushed east into the Pacific further than any other point on the Australian mainland, and the swell that wrapped around it broke along a series of long, peeling point breaks that a surfer could ride for the better part of a minute. The pass, where the wave folded around the headland below the lighthouse, Wattagos in the sheltered bay beneath the cape, Little Wattagos beyond it. These were not beach breaks that closed out in a second. They were long, ordered, world-class waves, and word of them travelled through the surfing population the way word of the silver had once travelled through the mining one, by mouth, fast, and to exactly the people most willing to move for it. So the two waves met, the surfers who wanted the point breaks and the alternative lifestylers who wanted the cheap land found themselves sharing the same emptied coastal town, and through the 1970s and into the 1980s, they colonized it between them. A whaling and slaughter town that had smelled of blood a decade earlier, now filled with people who kept vegetable gardens, sold crafts, ran health food shops, and paddled out at dawn before the wind came up. Rent was low because nobody with money wanted to live there. Houses were cheap because the industry that had built them was dying or dead. The very collapse that had hollowed the town out was what made it affordable enough to be reinvented. By the end of the 1980s, the reinvention was complete, though no one had planned it and no council had approved it. Byron Bay was no longer a working town. It was a counterculture town, a place defined by the surf, by the alternative movement that had washed down from Nimbin, by a way of living that treated the coast as something to be enjoyed rather than something to be worked. The old economy of butter and oil and carcasses was finished. A new economy had not yet arrived to replace it. What existed in the gap was a small, cheap, beautiful town full of people who had come there to drop out of the country's mainstream. The country's mainstream was about to come looking for them. Chapter 6. The Festival Coast. The mainstream arrived, at first, once a year, and it arrived to listen. In 1990, a promoter staged a blues and roots music festival in Byron Bay over the Easter long weekend. About 6,000 people came to that first blues fest. It was a modest number by the standards of what it would become, but it established a pattern that would define the town for the next 3 decades, that people would travel a long way and pay to do it. For a few days on the Byron coast with music playing, the festival grew. 6,000 became tens of thousands. What had begun as a small roots gathering swelled into one of the largest and most respected music festivals in the country, held every Easter, drawing artists and audiences from around the world to a floodplain a few kilometers from the beach. Bluesfest was the older event. The larger one came later, and it came with a younger crowd. In 2001, a new festival called Splendor in the Grass held its first edition at Belongil Fields on the northern edge of the town. It was pitched not at the roots music audience of Bluesfest, but at a younger, national, indie and rock and dance audience. The university-age crowd for whom a winter weekend in Byron became a fixture of the year. Splendor outgrew Belongil within a decade. In 2013, it moved to a permanent home at North Byron Parklands, a purpose-acquired site a short distance up the coast. And there it grew to a scale that the original counterculture settlers could not have imagined. Tens of thousands of people a day. Later, in its largest years, crowds approaching 50,000. A temporary city of tents and stages rising out of the coastal paddocks for one weekend and vanishing again, larger for those days than the permanent town it sat beside. 2 festivals then bracketing the year, Bluesfest at Easter, Splendor in winter, and between and around them a steady traffic of smaller events, markets and gatherings that turned the town's calendar into a near continuous season. The economy that the collapse of industry had failed to replace had finally been replaced, and it ran on music. But music was only the visible peak of it. Underneath the festivals ran something larger and steadier, and it moved on the backs of the young. By the 1990s and into the 2000s, Byron Bay had become a fixed point on the East Coast Backpacker Trail, the corridor that ran up the New South Wales and Queensland coast from Sydney toward Cairns, travelled every year by tens of thousands of young people from Britain, Europe and beyond, working their way north on a working holiday visa. Byron was a mandatory stop on that route, a rite of passage between Sydney and the Gold Coast, and the town reshaped itself to receive them. Backpacker hostels multiplied. Cheap beds, cheap beer, surf schools, and hire boards became the visible economy of the main street. The alternative lifestyle town of the 1980s acquired, over the top of itself, a party town for the young and transient. And the two coexisted, the wellness and the hedonism, the yoga at dawn and the hostel bar at midnight, sharing the same few streets. It was a town built now on 3 things, none of which had existed in the working town of the 1950s: music, surf, and cheap beds. The surf had drawn the first newcomers. The music drew the crowds. The cheap beds moved the young through in their tens of thousands, year after year, each cohort passing on the name to the next. Byron had become famous, not as a place people were from, but as a place people went. And fame of that particular kind, in a small and beautiful coastal town, was worth a great deal of money to anyone who could buy a piece of it. In the decade that followed, people with a great deal of money began to notice. Chapter 7. The Hemsworth Effect. The people who noticed were not backpackers, and they did not come for the hostels. In 2014, the actor Chris Hemsworth, then near the height of a Hollywood career, and his wife, the actor Elsa Pataki, bought a property at Broken Head, just south of Byron Bay, for a reported $7 million. They did not treat it as a holiday house. They moved their family there from Los Angeles, and over the years that followed, they spent a reported $9 million more rebuilding the estate into a compound whose scale had no precedent on that stretch of coast. A movie star had chosen the old whaling town, not to visit, but to live in. And in the economy of attention that Byron now ran on, that choice was worth more than any festival ticket ever sold. Others followed, because that is how the geography of celebrity works. Where one recognizable name settles, the coastline acquires a reputation as a place where such people can live, and the reputation draws the next. Byron and its hinterland filled, through the second half of the 2000s, with a new class of resident actors, models, entrepreneurs, and the vast attendant population of the online age. Reports circulated, some confirmed and some not, of other Hollywood figures buying or building or looking in the district. Matt Damon and Natalie Portman among the names that surfaced in the press, spending time on the coast as guests or seekers of property. The precise holdings mattered less than the pattern. The town that had been colonized by dropouts in the 1970s was being colonized again by their opposite. What the new residents brought with them, beyond money, was an industry of image. Byron became the wellness capital of Australia, and in the same motion, its influencer capital, a backdrop of beach and light and green hinterland against which a certain kind of life could be photographed and sold. The yoga and the health food that the alternative settlers had brought down from Nimbin 40 years earlier were repackaged at scale into a commercial aesthetic worth an enormous amount to the people who could perform it convincingly. The town's own history as a counterculture refugee became its most marketable asset, sold back to the world by people who had bought their way into it. In 2022, the arrangement acquired its most visible symbol, and the town rejected it. Netflix released a reality series called Byron Buys, filmed in and around the town, following a cast of local influencers. The production drew organized local anger before it aired and after. Protests on the beach, objections from residents and from Arakwal representatives, a sense among many who lived there that the last thing the town had to sell, its name, was being taken from it and turned into content by people who did not belong to it. The series went ahead regardless. Its existence was proof of what Byron had become. Not a place, but a brand, valuable enough that a global streaming company would build a show around the fact of it. And under all of it, quietly, the ground itself was changing hands and changing price. Celebrity money and the money that follows, celebrity flooded into a small market with a fixed amount of coastline, and the market did what such markets do. Property values began to climb, not gradually, and not within reach of the people who had lived there through the cheap decades. The surfers, the alternative lifestylers, the workers who kept the cafes and the surf schools and the hostels running, had come to Byron precisely because it was cheap. That condition was ending. The town was becoming one of the most expensive places in the country to live, and the people who had made it worth living in were beginning, one household at a time, to find that they could no longer afford the ground beneath them. Chapter 8. 2 million visitors. A town of 9,000 permanent residents receives, in an ordinary year, close to 2 million visitors. The arithmetic of that ratio does not resolve into anything a planner would design on purpose. For every person who lives in Byron Bay, more than 200 arrive across the year to stand on its beaches, and the town that had been rebuilt by surfers and alternative lifestylers on the cheap now found itself carrying a load no amount of counterculture had prepared it for. International lists began naming it among the worst places on Earth for over-tourism, alongside cities 20 and 50 times its size. Byron did not have the size, it had the ratio. The housing went first, and it went the way housing goes in a place worth more to a visitor for a weekend than to a worker for a year. A house that could be let by the night to travellers earned, in a peak season, a multiple of what it earned let by the year to a nurse or a school teacher, and so the arithmetic did what arithmetic does. Short-term holiday rentals moved through the housing stock the way water moves through sand, quietly and completely, taking cottages that had once held families and converting them into beds that stood empty on weeknights in winter and full at any price the summer would bear. The stock did not shrink. The stock simply stopped being available to anyone who lived there. Then the pandemic arrived, and it did to Byron the opposite of what it did to most towns. As the cities emptied and remote work loosened the tie between a job and a postcode, the money that had been landing on the coastline in trickles began to land in a flood. Buyers who could now work from anywhere chose to work from the most photographed beach town in the country, and they bid against one another for a fixed supply of houses on a narrow strip of land between the hinterland and the sea. The median house price in Byron Bay, which had sat near $1.5 million in 2020, passed $2 million within a year and kept climbing, well past $2.5 million, in a market that had no more land to make and no intention of building down. A place that had been colonised precisely because it was cheap became one of the most expensive postcodes in Australia. The people already there watched the ground move under them, a town that had been rebuilt 40 years earlier by people who came because no one else wanted it, was now wanted by everyone, and the wanting priced out the wanting's own children. The families who had bought in the empty years found themselves sitting on paper fortunes they could not spend without leaving, and the workers who kept the cafes and the surf schools and the wellness studios running found the rents rising faster than any wage the tourist economy paid. The very success of the place, the 2 million arrivals, the celebrity money, the doubled prices, was quietly hollowing out the town that produced it, converting a community into a destination, one sale, one letting, one departure at a time. Nothing about it looked like a decline. Every number pointed up. And that was the problem. Chapter 9. The Reckoning. The unravelling did not announce itself as an unravelling. It arrived, in the manner of these things, as weather. In late February and early March of 2022, the northern rivers of New South Wales received rainfall of a scale the record had no room for, and the rivers that drain the hinterland behind Byron rose past every mark ever cut into their banks. The town of Lismore, an hour inland, went under to a depth that put water over the second story of buildings that had survived a century of floods. Across the region, the toll ran to around 13 lives, and the damage bill made it, by the accounting that followed, the most expensive natural disaster in Australian history. Thousands of people were driven out of homes that could not be dried, cleaned, or afforded again, and many of them washed up, displaced, and looking for anywhere to sleep, in the same overpriced coastal towns that already had nowhere to put them. The festivals went next, and their going marked the end of the era they had built. Splendour in the Grass, the event that had drawn tens of thousands a day to the paddocks north of town every winter for 2 decades, was cancelled in 2024, its organisers citing circumstances they did not fully name. It was cancelled again in 2025. A second year gone. A silence that began to look permanent. And Bluesfest, the older of the two, the festival that had started with about 6,000 people in 1990 and grown into a fixture of the Easter calendar, reached the end of its run in the most literal way a business can. In March of 2026, after 36 years, Bluesfest Enterprises collapsed into voluntary liquidation, and the festival that had helped make Byron a music town was cancelled with it. The coast that had sold itself on the promise of the next great weekend had run out of weekends to sell. The law caught up with the housing at almost the same moment. Byron Shire, watching its workers vanish into the hinterland, had asked for a hard limit on how many nights a house could be let to holidaymakers when no owner lived on site, a cap of 90 days a year. The New South Wales Independent Planning Commission heard the case and set the number lower still, at 60. In September of 2024, the 60-day annual cap on non-hosted short-term rentals took effect, with certain tourism precincts in Byron Bay and Brunswick Heads carved out as exemptions and fines running as high as $12,000 for landlords who ran past it. It was the most serious attempt yet to prize the housing back from the visitors. An analysis commissioned by Airbnb, a party with an interest in the answer, reported that it had not improved affordability at all, and underneath the floods and the cancelled festivals and the rental cap ran a single problem that connected all three. There were no longer enough people who could afford to live near enough to work. Venues that survived the pandemic and the festival collapse found they could not staff the doors that remained open. Kitchens went short of chefs, cafes short of hands, the whole hospitality machine short of the workers who had once lived a bike ride from their shifts and now lived, if they stayed at all, an hour inland in the flood country the water had just been through. A town that hosted close to 2 million guests a year was running out of the people it needed to host them. Chapter 10. The town Australia fell out of love with. Walk the streets behind the beach on an ordinary weekday now, and the town reads as two towns occupying the same ground. One of them is visible everywhere. The visitors, the wellness studios, the coffee, the money, the coastline bought up by people whose faces are known in Los Angeles. The other is the one that is missing. The nurses who staff the hospital, the teachers who fill the classrooms, the chefs and cleaners and bartenders who make a tourist town function increasingly do not live in it. They have been pushed out along the roads that run inland, into the hinterland the floods went through, trading a place near their work for a rent they can survive, commuting back each morning to serve a town that can no longer house them. The backpackers who once treated Byron as an unmissable stop on the East Coast Trail have begun to do the arithmetic that everyone else did. A bed in Byron now costs what a week in Southeast Asia costs, and the young travelers who kept the hostels full and the surf schools busy have quietly redirected themselves toward Bali and the cheaper coasts of the region, leaving the town that sold them the idea of a cheap paradise unable to price itself as one. The people who built the place, and the people who came to enjoy it on little money, are drifting away in the same direction and for the same reason. The town has become too valuable for the lives that made it worth valuing. What remains is a paradox with no comfortable side to stand on. Byron Bay is more famous, more visited, and more expensive than it has ever been, and it is emptying of its own people while it fills with everyone else's. The coastline belongs increasingly to those who can pay for a view they occupy a few weeks a year. The houses behind it turn over by the night. And the community that was assembled over 50 years out of surfers and dairy families and festival goers and the workers who fed them all is being disassembled quietly, one sold cottage and one loaded van at a time, in a place too loved for almost anyone who belongs to it to remain. Above all of it, the Cape Byron Lighthouse still turns. It stands where it has stood since 1901 on the most easterly point of the Australian mainland, and its beam sweeps out over the water and back across the land in the same slow arc it has always made. Below it, in the early evening, the beach is crowded. Visitors on the sand, cameras raised to the same sunset that has sold the town to the world, cars circling for the parking the town cannot supply. The light passes over them and moves on, over the headland, over the darkening streets, behind the dunes where the lit windows are fewer than they were, and the vans idle at the curb with their curtains drawn. The lighthouse was built to keep ships off the rocks, to hold a place for the people coming ashore. It still turns faithfully over a beach full of people and a town losing the ones who live there. And it is worth asking what a town is finally for, once it can no longer house the people who make it work.